Welcome to the Erin Harber Show. My special guest today, Dr. Philip Landrigan from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Doctor, thanks for joining me.
Erin, a pleasure. Thank you.
It's great having you on the show. I want to talk a little bit about your textbook, which is extraordinarily comprehensive about children's health and toxicity, children and their relationship health-wise with the environment. Actually, describe the text to me, and I'm not going to tell you I read all 600 pages, but I was very impressed with the number of different subjects addressed, the fact that you gathered so many experts to talk about different aspects of children and the relationship they have health-wise with the environment.
Yeah, so my co-editor, Dr. Ruth Etzel, and I were motivated to write the book because we saw several things going on in American society. First of all, rates of a whole series of chronic diseases have been rising steadily in American kids for the past 3 decades. For example, asthma has tripled in frequency. The incidence of childhood cancer, that's to say the number of new cases per 1,000 children, has risen about 40%.
And over a third of childhood deaths are due to cancer, is that right?
Yeah, after accidents, cancer is the largest cause of childhood death, that's right. Obesity has tripled. Certain birth defects have doubled in frequency. So that whole problem of rising rates of disease was one trigger to the book. At the same time, there's a growing body of research that has shown very clearly that a number of the toxic chemicals that we've produced over the past half century are either causing or aggravating these diseases. So we just felt it was time to pull this body of knowledge together, to do it in a readable, accessible fashion, and make it available to practicing pediatricians, family doctors, nurses, others who care for children, so that they could, if they saw a child with lead poisoning or a child exposed to pesticides or a child whose asthma might have been aggravated by an environmental factor, that they could reach to the bookshelf and refer to the book and get some guidance on how best to deal with the child.
In many cases, though, wouldn't pediatricians not have the information, not be aware of what chemicals a child was exposed to?
You know, this is a big problem in that medical education and also residency training in pediatrics provides very little time and energy to looking at environmental factors. I think most pediatricians are pretty knowledgeable about childhood lead poisoning. They're knowledgeable about asthma and its triggers. But beyond that, they don't have a lot of information. And then, yes, you're absolutely right that there's the knowledge problem, that a lot of times people don't know what they've been exposed to because the ingredients aren't spelled out and they just don't know.
So what do we do about that? How do we become better informed as parents? And what could we actually do? Have you considered, how do we educate kids, including young children, so that they might actually be aware of an incident or that they might have been exposed to something and as a result need to tell their mom or their dad that something happened or something funny happened?
Well, I think there's several strategies for that. One is to educate parents, because especially little children need protection by their parents, and to that end, my wife and I have written a book called Environmental Toxins and Children's Health, What Everyone Needs to Know, which was published a few months by Oxford University Press. And this book is written very directly for parents, and the goal is to give parents practical, actionable advice about what they can do to protect their children against environmental threats. And then when it comes to children, you can begin to reach children on these topics at maybe 1st or 2nd grade, I think. And little kids just love protecting the environment. And if you give little kids knowledge, they will act on it. They're really great.
So give me an example. At what age can we really start teaching kids about toxic chemicals and in a manner where at least they have some awareness that if something happens that they can tell their mom or dad that they smelled something funny or something burned their eyes or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, I would say around 1st or 2nd grade, you can educate children about acids and alkalis and lead and pesticides, the basic toxic chemicals. At that age, children will understand the meaning of a skull and crossbones on a bottle, for example.
And how about parents? Obviously, that education needs to occur preferably before they have kids.
That's right. And one of the groups with whom we've been working in recent years are the OBGYN community, because after all, before the baby is born, it's the OBGYN and not the pediatrician who's taking care of the child. And more in the past decades, the obstetricians have accepted responsibility to educate pregnant women about avoiding not only tobacco and alcohol, which they've done for a long time, but also avoiding pesticides, not eating those species of fish that are high in mercury and PCBs, staying away from pesticides and so on.
So what other advice would you give to parents who want to raise their kids in a healthy manner, and given that we're in such a toxic world at times?
Yeah. So I think it's very important to empower parents by giving them a finite number of pieces of information that they can act on. So I tell them, first of all, if they're buying a house, to very carefully check out the house, make sure there's no lead paint, no old asbestos from 40 years ago, and do a radon check in the house. Make sure that radon isn't percolating up out of the ground. I talk about the importance of minimizing or avoiding the use of pesticides, and what that means in practical terms is eat organic as much as you can, because families who eat organic have 90% lower levels of pesticides in their body than families who eat so-called conventionally grown food. And thirdly, people need to know about air pollution, not to go out and run a marathon on a day when the pollution levels are high.
So in terms of toxicity, you mentioned foods. My impression is there are some foods where the pesticide residue difference really is slight. For example, and tell me if I'm wrong, between organic broccoli and regular broccoli.
Yeah, broccoli is a good example where there's not much difference. The Environmental Working Group, which is a not-for-profit, EWG.org, have published a list of what they call the dirty dozen, the fruits and vegetables that have the highest levels of pesticides unless they're grown organically. And then they've also published a list of the clean 15, of which broccoli is a prominent member.
And the dirty dozen, correct me if I'm wrong, I assume include a lot of fruits and vegetables that have thin skins, like strawberries or blueberries.
Exactly, because fruits with thin, soft skins like peaches and strawberries and raspberries are the fruits that are most vulnerable to the insects and require the heaviest applications.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Dr. Landrigan in just a moment.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
I'm Erin Harber, host of the Erin Harber Show. You can follow the show on Twitter for instant notification of new episodes, live event invitations, outtakes, and behind-the-scene photos. And tweet us your topic and guest suggestions today. I'm Erin Harber, host of the Erin Harber Show. I very much would like to hear from you about the program, so please send me an email with your thoughts. You can suggest what topics I should cover, what guests I should invite to be on the show, or even what specific questions you would like me to ask. This is your program, so send your suggestions to Erin@harbertv.com. I promise to personally read every one, so email me today. And most of all, thanks for watching.
Join me and watch the Erin Harber Show.
Watch the Erin Harper Show.
Watch the Erin Harber Show.
Watch the Erin Harper Show.
Watch the Erin Harper Show.
I'm Reverend Jesse Jackson. Watch the Erin Harper Show and Keep Hope Alive.
I'm Erin Harber, host of the Erin Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
The Erin Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbertv.com.
Welcome back to the show. We're with Dr. Philip Landrigan, and we're talking about toxicity in kids. But we can talk about adults too. But do you think Americans are desensitized to issues related to pollution, chemical, not just chemical pollution, but other forms as well? in terms of health issues, given that we continue, I think most of us, to live in a society and that certainly has a lot of toxic chemicals in our food, in our water, in the air, et cetera.
Yeah, there certainly are a lot of toxic chemicals in our environment today. In the 60 years since the end of World War II, during the time when the chemical manufacturing industry has really taken off in this country, more than 80,000, more than 85,000 new chemicals have been produced and put into consumer products, and many of them are out in the environment. But I think people in this country, especially younger people, are becoming more and more aware of these chemicals, more aware of their potential to cause harm. Witness the growth, for example, of farmers markets, of Whole Foods, of people that are growing their own food. I think that there's a groundswell of interest, at least in certain sectors of our society, to protect ourselves against this. And I think it was because of that widespread interest that a year and a half ago the Congress passed bipartisan legislation, hard as it may be to believe anything could happen bipartisanly in Washington these days. But they passed bipartisan legislation to strengthen chemical safety provisions in this country.
So you had mentioned lead paint. How does a parent know if his or her apartment or house has lead paint?
The only safe way, the only secure way to know that an apartment or a house has lead paint is to bring in a professional with a handheld X-ray device who can X-ray the windowsills and the door frames and see if there's lead. There are little tests that you can buy at the hardware store. They're not very good. They miss a lot of lead. It's worth spending a couple $100 to bring in a professional.
And that's what it costs.
Yes.
And in terms of the whole issue of toxicity, I'd be really interested in your take on where we are scientifically in understanding the impact of the combination of different chemicals. Certainly there's often a lot of testing where one chemical is tested on a standalone basis, or sometimes two, but with tens of thousands of chemicals in the environment, or that we potentially are exposed to in one form or another, including ingesting, it seems that the combinations and permutations of all those are almost infinite.
Right. This is a topic that's really very much in the current interest. So there are two big developments that are I think going to really break this open. The first is that the pediatric community has learned how to do what we call prospective longitudinal birth cohort studies. I know that's a mouthful, but what it means quite simply is that we work with the obstetricians to enroll women when they're still pregnant, take a careful history of exposure from the pregnant women, get blood samples, get urine samples, get hair samples, so that we can measure what chemicals are in their body in real time while they're actually pregnant, which is when the most vulnerable periods are in the child's life, and then follow the babies longitudinally with examinations at birth, at 1 year, 3, 5, 7, 10 years of age. And it's a very powerful kind of study that enables us to relate early life exposures to the later occurrence of disease and other health problems. The second big development is high throughput chemical testing. Just as we've developed high throughput genetic testing that enables us to screen a person's genome in 24 hours, it's now possible to take one of those blood samples for a pregnant woman and screen it for several hundred chemicals at the same time. And with powerful computers, you can relate this combination of chemicals, which has come to be known as the exposome. You can relate that to health outcomes, disease risk in children. So I think in the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to see some real breakthroughs in this area.
What are the challenges presented by the use of plastics and the way plastics, including microparticles, have gotten into the environment?
Yeah, well, plastics contain a whole soup of different chemicals, and many of those chemicals can leach out of the plastic. They can get into food, they can get into drinking water, they can get into a child's body if the child is chewing the plastic. One class of chemicals that's in plastics, which is quite common, are called phthalates, and if a mother is exposed to phthalates during her pregnancy, these chemicals can affect the development of the reproductive organs of her child, especially if the baby is a boy. There's another category of chemicals, bisphenol A, and there's some emerging evidence that early life exposure to bisphenol A can reduce a child's intelligence. So more and more, I think you're seeing families moving away from plastic, storing their food in glass containers like our grandmothers used to, using stainless steel drinking bottles instead of plastic bottles. And I think it's a trend that will continue.
Hasn't the food industry moved away from bisphenol A, BPAs that used to frequently be used in, for example, the lining of cans with food in them? Haven't a lot of the companies put themselves on a path to no longer use BPAs?
So a number of companies have indeed taken out BPA. The problem is they've replaced it with BPA's first cousin called BPS, which has many of the same toxic properties. So we still have a ways to go on that one. So
the cans I bought I thought were safe. It doesn't sound like they're as safe as I thought.
You might want to buy fresh food.
Well, that was subtle. In terms of what about the role of greenhouse gases on the environment in terms of whether it be food production, whether it be, does that affect young people as well and adults too?
Yeah, so the continuing emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the environment it is not having direct effects on individual health the way toxic chemicals are, but it's certainly having impacts on the health of populations. And so, for example, as the world gets warmer, we're seeing more drought. That leads to crop failure, it leads to forest fires, and those events directly affect people's health. Crop failure leads to migrations. Some of the big migrations that are going on right now in Africa and the Middle East are driven in part by crop failure that traces back to decreased rainfall and increasing warmth. Another consequence is that certain insects, the mosquitoes that carry dengue and other vector-borne diseases, are spreading. Colleagues of mine at the University of Texas Medical Center in Houston are quite convinced that within a few years dengue is going to be endemic, that is to say routinely occurring along the Gulf Coast states.
That would be a huge change.
A big change indeed, yeah.
All right, we're going to take our last break and we'll be right back in just a moment.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
I'm Erin Harber, host of the Erin Harber Show. You can follow the show on Twitter for instant notification of new episodes, live event invitations, outtakes, and behind-the-scene photos. And tweet us your topic and guest suggestions today.
The Rex Hal Broadcaster of the Year Award recognizes an individual who, through leadership, skill, and dedication, is advancing the broadcast industry in our state and our nation. Tonight, we honor Erin Harber. Erin has worked extensively in the media as a host, producer, political and economic commentator, and columnist. Today, the Erin Harber Show is the focus of his media involvement. Erin, it is a privilege to present you with the Rex Hal Broadcaster of the Year Award. Congratulations.
Just make journalism great again.
Join me and watch the Erin Harber Show.
Watch the Erin Harper Show.
Watch the Erin Harber Show.
Watch the Erin Harper Show.
Watch the Erin Harper Show.
I'm Reverend Jesse Jackson. Watch the Erin Harber Show and Keep Hope Alive.
I'm Erin Harber, host of the Erin Harber Show.
Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbortv.com.
Welcome back to the show. This is our last segment with Dr. Philip Landrigan. So, Phil, what about testing? What kind of testing could we be doing that we're not doing now that would give us much more information about the toxicity of chemicals, and especially combinations of chemicals?
Right. A big problem is that many of the chemicals that are on the market, widely used in a lot of products, have never been tested for safety, never been examined for their toxicity. And that reflects a failure by the chemical companies in which they don't accept responsibility, and it also reflects a failure of government not forcing the companies to test. The law that was passed a year and a half ago will require much stricter chemical testing. Now it remains to be enforced.
You know, Phil, given the fact that so many chemicals manifest an impact, a health impact, often after decades of being in the human body, whether it was a result of a one-time exposure or a series of exposures, how do we address those challenges in terms of knowing what a chemical, what the impact of a chemical or a combination of chemicals could be if it takes 30, 40, or 50 years?
And that's a perennial problem, and there are really two strategies for dealing with it. The traditional strategy has been to test chemicals in animals. Rodents have a lifespan of 2 or 3 years, and so what takes 30 years to develop in a human develops in a rat in a year and a half. The second, more modern strategy is to take advantage of the fact that toxic chemicals have chemical signals and molecular signals, and in new what's called high throughput toxicologic testing, you can screen chemicals for toxic properties very, very quickly. And that sort of work is going on now at EPA and at the National Institutes of Health.
And what about, I mean, from a big picture perspective, I mean, we live in a capitalistic society where companies are under pressure to show results on a quarterly basis every 90 days. How does that impact what we do in terms of especially the decisions companies and organizations make when it comes to the use of chemicals?
Well, that's a real issue. I mean, in some ways, that's the issue that lies at the core of this whole conversation, because on the one hand, we want to take well-considered actions that will protect our health and the planet's health in the long term, be sustainable. And then, as you say, there's this drive to increase profits every 3 months. And I think at some point there's going to have to be a big meeting of the minds in our society that tries to reconcile those two. There's very little reconciliation at the present time between those two viewpoints.
And what kind of reconciliation occurs in other countries? What are examples of countries that you think are doing a better job of addressing this challenge?
I think in general the European Union is doing the best in the world, and the European Union has taken the view that new chemicals cannot be allowed on markets until they're proven safe. It's very different from in this country where new chemicals are considered innocent until proven guilty. And I think the European approach is much more protective of human health and the environment.
Is there a way we could use that research, the research that they do, so we could fast track certain chemicals here?
Oh yes, the blueprint exists. They have legislation which goes by the acronym of REACH, which some of us who, like myself, who work in the field would love to see adopted in the United States. But I don't think it's going to happen this year.
Okay, and what does REACH do?
REACH requires a chemical manufacturer to notify the European Chemical Agency that they're about to bring a new chemical to market. The chemical agency then demands that the manufacturer do a certain level of toxicologic testing. The amount of testing is dependent upon the intended use of the chemical. If it's a feedstock chemical that's going to stay in the factory, it doesn't require much testing. If it's going to show up in baby bottles, it needs a lot of testing.
And so why couldn't we use those results so that companies here don't have to go through a redundant approval process?
We'd love to be able to do that, and it's the logical thing to do.
I would think that'd be a win-win for everybody. Why don't we do that?
because the chemical manufacturing industry has resisted it.
And why? If they're getting approval, I'm talking about for products that were approved by the European Union, why couldn't we just say if the European Union has approved it, given the rigor of their testing, we'll almost by default approve it here and fast track it, making it much less expensive for companies to get something approved?
It sounds like a win-win, but what's actually happening is that multinationals who make products with a certain brand name in Europe without toxic chemicals like phthalates are selling the same brand name product in this country with phthalates. And they have no desire to give up that profit margin.
All right, what can adults do to reduce their risk of cancer when it comes to the consumption, whether intentional or not, or exposure to chemicals?
Well, pesticides are a big place where families can take action, where adults can take action. Learn to live with a few dandelions on your lawn, eat organic, don't spray cockroach spray under the sink, instead use integrated pest management. Avoid, or at least minimize the use of x-rays, which x-rays are potent causes of cancer. Be very wary of solvents. Some of the solvents are known to cause leukemia.
You're talking about like certain household cleaning products? Yes. As well. So when you look at how we live our lives in the United States, it seems obvious that a very high percentage of cancers are due to environmental conditions we could change as a country. They're due to personal choices that we make as individuals. How do we do a better job of educating the public so we're all making better decisions and ones that result in a healthier life and a longer life that's also healthy?
Right, well, that's exactly why my colleague and I wrote our book, to put the information out there. Our theory is that doctors and nurses are some of the very best health educators out there. And we reasoned that if we could put good, credible information into the hands of practicing physicians, that they in turn could advise their patients on how to live a healthy life. So, you know, that's worked in the past. We've knocked down cigarette smoking by an enormous fraction in this country. Once doctors persuaded their patients that smoking would hurt their own individual health. Now the same thing has to take place for chemicals.
So in conclusion, if you could wave a magic wand and make one change, whether it be a function of how we conduct our lives or a piece of legislation, what would you like to see done or see people do that you think would have the greatest impact on the health of American citizens?
I would go for two things. Number one, I would take really aggressive measures to clean up air pollution in this country. I would push very hard for clean cars. I would minimize the burning of coal and other fossil fuels. And number two, I would want to see the Congress, both parties, work together to protect the health of the American public, protect the health of American kids, and pass really strict, enforceable legislation like the legislation in Europe that requires chemicals be well tested before they come to market.
And do you see that as only a remote possibility, or do you have hope for that?
I'm optimistic. I think that there's a groundswell of interest. There's a groundswell of revulsion against the rollback of environmental protections. I think there's a lot of energy that is poised and ready to come into this fray. All
right, well, let's hope you're right. Phil, thanks
so
so much.
Thank you, Erin.
Yeah. You bet. That was Dr. Phil Landrigan. I'm Erin Harber. Thanks for watching.
Please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.